The autumn leaves scattered across the polished marble floors of Hayes and Partners as I made my way through the lobby, my heels clicking against the stone in a familiar rhythm. 20 years of marriage, and I still got butterflies bringing Richard his forgotten laptop, a small tradition that had started in our early days when he was just a junior partner. The security guard, Tom, gave me his usual warm smile as I signed in, though today there was something different in his eyes. Was it pity? I should have known then. Should have noticed how the usual bustling energy of the 48th floor felt heavier, more subdued. The whispers that stopped when I passed by. The way Richard's assistant, Cassandra Miller, wasn't at her usual post outside his corner office. But love has a way of blinding us to the obvious, doesn't it? Before I share what happened next, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this journey. Your support means everything, and if you connect with stories of resilience and reinvention, consider subscribing. Together, we're building a community of strength and understanding. Now, let me take you back to the moment that changed everything. The handle of Richard's leather laptop bag felt cool against my palm as I approached his office. Through the glass walls, I could see him standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silver-streaked hair catching the morning light. He was on the phone, gesturing animatedly. That familiar stance he took when closing a big deal. 20 years of marriage had taught me every nuance of his body language, or so I thought. I was about to knock when I heard her laugh, musical, young, confident. Cassandra emerged from the private conference room adjoining Richard's office. Her auburn hair cascading over a designer blazer I recognized from the shopping trip we'd taken together just last month. I'd helped her pick it out, sharing my own tips about corporate fashion, mentoring her like the daughter I never had. The irony of that moment would hit me much later. Richard turned and their eyes met in a way that made my heart stop. There was an electricity, an intimacy that felt like a physical blow. In that split second, standing there with his forgotten laptop in my hands, 2 decades of memories flashed through my mind. Our wedding day at the plaza, the way he'd held my hand through 3 miscarriages, the countless dinner parties where we'd hosted clients together, building his law firm into one of Manhattan's most prestigious. I watched as Cassandra handed him a document, their fingers brushing longer than necessary. She leaned in close, pointing at something on the page, and he smiled. That crooked, boyish smile that had once been reserved for me. The same smile I'd fallen in love with at Columbia Law, back when we were both bright-eyed students with dreams bigger than our bank accounts. My knuckles turned white around the laptop bag's handle. I could have burst in, could have created a scene right there, in front of the morning staff. But 2 decades as a corporate wife had taught me something about timing and dignity. Instead, I straightened my spine, turned on my heel, and walked away, my mind already racing ahead to the merger documents I'd helped Richard review last week. The ones with all those curious new clauses about asset division and overseas accounts. The elevator ride down was a blur. Tom called out something as I passed through the lobby, but I barely heard him over the roaring in my ears. Outside, the October wind whipped at my face, carrying the scent of coffee from the artisan cafe where Richard and I had shared breakfast just that morning. He'd been distracted, checking his phone more than usual, but I'd attributed it to the upcoming merger with West Coast giant Miller and Associates. Miller. The name hit me like a slap. Cassandra Miller. The merger. The late nights, the weekend meetings, the sudden business trips to Los Angeles. All those times Richard had insisted I didn't need to attend the merger dinners because they would be boring technical discussions. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. I found myself walking, then running, my Louboutins echoing against the sidewalk as I made my way to Bryant Park. Our spot. The place where Richard had proposed 20 years ago, down on one knee with a ring he'd spent 6 months of his junior associate's salary to buy. I collapsed onto a bench, clutching his laptop bag like a lifeline. A couple walked past, young and in love, sharing a coffee and a secret smile. I remembered being that young once, that certain. Richard and I had been unstoppable back then, the ambitious lawyer and his equally ambitious wife, working in tandem to build an empire. I'd put my own law career on hold to support his dreams, to be the perfect corporate wife, to build the connections and social networks that had helped make Hayes and Partners what it was today. My phone buzzed. A text from Olivia, my best friend. "Maddie, where are you? Just heard something at the club. Call me ASAP." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. Of course, the gossip had already started. In our social circle, news traveled faster than light. But I wasn't the same starry-eyed girl who'd said yes in this park 2 decades ago. I was Madeline Carter Hayes, and I had spent 20 years learning every intricacy of corporate law alongside my husband. I knew exactly where every account was, every asset, every skeleton in every closet. Richard might have forgotten his laptop at home this morning, but I hadn't forgotten who I was. I opened his laptop bag, my hands steady despite everything. Inside, along with his computer, was a manila envelope he'd asked me to proofread last night. The latest draft of the merger agreement. I pulled it out, my legal training kicking in as I began to read between the lines with new eyes. There, buried in the carefully worded clauses and subsections, I saw it all. The plan for after the merger, the strategic division of assets, the subtle redirections of power. Richard had taught me well over the years, including his favorite saying, "In law, like in chess, you have to think 5 moves ahead." As I sat there in Bryant Park, where our story had once begun, I allowed myself a small smile. Because what Richard had forgotten was that he wasn't the only one who knew how to play chess. Looking back, the signs had been there for months. Subtle shifts in our carefully constructed world that I'd dismissed as stress from the pending merger. The first real crack appeared during the annual partners retreat in the Hamptons 3 months ago. I remember standing in our beach house kitchen, preparing the appetizers for what would be my last time hosting the firm's inner circle. The sunset painted the marble countertops in shades of amber as I arranged prosciutto-wrapped figs, Richard's favorite. 20 years of these gatherings had taught me exactly how to play my role. The accomplished hostess, the supportive wife, the woman who could discuss modern art with the same ease as corporate tax law. The sound of laughter drifted in from the deck where Richard was holding court with the other partners. "Let me help with those." Cassandra's voice startled me. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light, holding an empty wine pitcher. She'd been hired 6 months ago, just as the merger talks with Miller and Associates began. I'd taken her under my wing, seeing in her younger self the same ambition I'd once had. "The Cabernet is in the cellar," I said, gesturing toward the stairs. "Second rack on the left." But she didn't move. Instead, she set the pitcher down and picked up a fig, examining it with careful interest. "You know," she said, her voice carrying a note I couldn't quite place, "Richard mentioned you used to practice law yourself." She took a delicate bite, and I noticed she was wearing the Cartier bracelet I'd seen Richard buying last month. He'd claimed it was for his sister's birthday. "Georgetown Law," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Class of '98. The same year I'd met Richard, both of us drunk on ambition and possibilities." "And you gave it up?" Her question carried an edge that made me pause. "To become this?" She gestured vaguely at the perfectly arranged appetizers, the immaculate kitchen, the life I'd built. Before I could respond, Richard appeared behind her. Something flickered in his eyes. Concern? Warning? Before he smoothed it away with a practiced smile. "There you are," he said. And for a moment I wasn't sure which of us he was addressing. "The Wilsons are asking about your famous crab cakes," he continued, looking at me but standing just a bit too close to Cassandra. She shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward him. That night, after the guests had left and the caterers had cleaned, up I stood in our master bathroom, removing my makeup while Richard showered. Through the steam-clouded glass, his silhouette was familiar, yet suddenly strange. "Cassandra did well tonight," he said casually, his voice nearly lost in the sound of running water. The Miller and Associates team seemed impressed with her grasp of the merger details. I watched my reflection as I removed my earrings, the sapphires he'd given me on our 15th anniversary. "She's wearing the bracelet you bought for Claire." The water stopped. For 3 heartbeats, silence filled the bathroom. "Maddie?" His tone held a warning. "Your sister's birthday isn't for another 6 months," I continued, setting the earrings down with deliberate care. "And she hates Cartier. Always has." Richard stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around his waist. Water droplets clung to his silver-streaked hair, and for a moment, I saw the young lawyer I'd fallen in love with, the man who used to bring me coffee in the law library at midnight.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"It's not what you think," he said, but he couldn't quite meet my eyes in the mirror. "The merger is delicate. Miller and Associates. There are considerations." "Considerations," I repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Like the private dinners in Los Angeles? The weekend conferences that somehow never have room in the budget for partners' spouses." He moved behind me, placing his hands on my shoulders. Once, his touch would have melted my doubts away. Now it felt like ice. "You're being paranoid," he said softly. "This merger could make Hayes and Partners international. Everything I've worked for, everything we've built together, it all hinges on the next few months." I turned to face him, studying the man I'd shared my life with. "And Cassandra? What role does she play in this grand plan?" "She's just an assistant," he said quickly. Too quickly. "Her father's connections at Miller and Associates are useful, that's all." I thought of the way they'd stood together on the deck earlier, how their conversations seemed to consist more of silences than words, how she'd looked at me in the kitchen, not with admiration or gratitude, but with something closer to pity. "I see," I said, though what I was seeing wasn't what Richard thought. I was seeing the carefully constructed facade of our marriage developing hairline fractures. I was seeing the way power and ambition could reshape a person, turn them into someone you hardly recognized. That night, I lay awake long after Richard's breathing had evened into sleep. I thought about the young woman who'd left Georgetown Law to support her husband's dreams, who'd believed that love and partnership meant sometimes setting aside your own ambitions. The woman who'd gradually transformed herself into the perfect corporate wife, learning to navigate the subtle power plays and unspoken rules of Manhattan's legal elite. In the dark, I opened my laptop, its blue light casting shadows on the ceiling. My law license was still active. I'd maintained it all these years, telling myself it was just prudent, just in case. With practiced ease, I navigated to the state, bar website, then to the court records database. My password still worked. 20 years as a corporate wife hadn't dulled my legal instincts. If anything, they'd been sharpened by years of watching, listening, understanding how power really flowed through firms like Hayes and Partners. I began to search, starting with Miller and Associates. If Richard thought he was the only one who could play this game, he'd forgotten who he'd married. By dawn, I had a clear picture of exactly what was at stake in this merger, and why Cassandra Miller's role was far more significant than just an assistant with useful connections. The next morning, I served Richard his coffee with a smile, kissed him goodbye as he left for the office, and watched him drive away in his Mercedes. Then I called Olivia, my best friend, and the managing partner at Goldman Sachs Family Law Division. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, "and I need you to be very discreet." The game was already in motion, but Richard had forgotten. The most important rule of chess: sometimes the queen is more powerful than the king. The morning I discovered the full extent of Richard's betrayal was deceptively ordinary. Golden October sunlight streamed through the windows of our Park Avenue apartment as I reviewed the documents Olivia had quietly gathered for me. The coffee in my favorite porcelain cup had gone cold, forgotten as I absorbed the implications of what lay before me. Miller and Associates wasn't just merging with Hayes and Partners. They were orchestrating a complete takeover. The paperwork revealed a carefully constructed plan that would effectively dissolve the firm Richard and I had built together over 2 decades. But that wasn't what made my hands tremble as I turned the pages. There, buried in the fine print of subsidiary clauses and asset transfers, was Cassandra's name, or more specifically, her family's holding company, which owned a controlling interest in Miller and Associates. The intercom buzzed, startling me from my research. "Mrs. Hayes?" Our doorman's voice crackled through the speaker. "There's a delivery for you from Bergdorf's." I frowned, not recalling any recent purchases. "Send it up, James." Minutes later, I was staring at an elegant black garment bag. The card attached read simply, "For the merger announcement gala, R." With steady hands, I unzipped the bag, revealing a stunning Valentino gown in deep burgundy, my favorite color. The irony wasn't lost on me. 20 years of marriage, and Richard still remembered my preferences, even as he plotted to dismantle everything we'd built together. My phone chimed with a text from Cassandra. "The gown arrived. Can't wait to see you in it at the gala. We need to talk about the seating arrangements." The casual familiarity of her message made my stomach turn. I'd mentored her, shared confidences with her, treated her like family, all while she and Richard had been carefully positioning their pieces on the board. I hung the dress in my closet, next to 2 decades worth of gala gowns and cocktail dresses. Each one held memories, charity events, firm celebrations, client dinners. I'd worn them like armor, playing my part in Richard's rise to success. My fingers brushed against the beaded Chanel I'd worn the night Hayes and Partners had opened its doors. Richard had been so proud, so full of dreams for our future. We'd danced until dawn, drunk on champagne and possibilities. The sound of my phone ringing pulled me from my reverie. It was Marcus Wellington, one of the senior partners and Richard's oldest friend. "Maddie?" His voice was unusually hesitant. "Do you have a minute?" I settled into my home office chair, the documents from Olivia spread across my desk. "Of course, Marcus. What's on your mind?" There was a long pause. "I've been struggling with something. As Richard's friend, But you've also been family to Sarah and me all these years." My heart began to race, but my voice remained calm. "What is it?" "The merger." He started, then stopped. "There are things happening that don't feel right, decisions being made behind closed doors. Richard's been different." I thought of the young associate who'd stood as best man at our wedding, who'd named his daughter after me. "Marcus, if you know something, now is the time to tell me." He took a deep breath. "There's a partner meeting tonight. Off-site, very..." "Hush, hush. Richard's presenting the final merger terms. But Maddie, it's not just a merger. They're planning to dissolve Hayes and Partners completely. The firm will be absorbed into Miller and Associates, with most of the current partners being bought out or demoted." "And Richard?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He's been promised the position of managing director for their new European division, based in London." Marcus's voice dropped lower, with Cassandra as his co-director. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Not just an affair, not just a midlife crisis, but a complete erasure of our shared life and legacy. Richard wasn't just leaving me. He was abandoning everything and everyone who had helped build his success. "Thank you, Marcus," I said softly. "Sarah's lucky to have you." After hanging up, I sat in silence, watching the afternoon light create shadows on my office wall. On my desk, a framed photo caught my eye. Richard and me on our 20th anniversary, just 6 months ago. We were smiling at some joke now forgotten, his arm around my waist, my head tilted toward him in familiar intimacy. The woman in that photo still believed in her marriage, in the partnership she'd devoted her life to nurturing. But that woman wasn't me. Not anymore. I opened my laptop and began to type. Years of attending partner meetings, reviewing contracts, and hosting client dinners had given me an encyclopedic knowledge of Hayes & Partners operations. I knew where every skeleton was buried, every ethical line that had been skirted, every deal that had been sealed with a handshake and a blind eye. As the sun set over Manhattan, I drafted 3 emails. The first went to the Securities and Exchange Commission, detailing certain irregularities in recent international transactions. The second was addressed to the New York State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. The third I sent to myself, a comprehensive record of everything I'd discovered, encrypted, and dated. My phone buzzed again. Richard. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. I could picture him in his office, probably sharing a drink with Cassandra as they finalized their plans for their new life. What they didn't realize was that I had plans of my own. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd found in my earlier research. After 3 rings, a crisp voice answered. Catherine Miller's office. Ms. Miller? This is Madeline Hayes. I believe we need to discuss your daughter's role in the upcoming merger. I paused, letting my words sink in. And perhaps some concerning information about Hayes & Partners' recent international dealings. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, Mrs. Hayes, I've been expecting your call. Shall we meet for lunch tomorrow? I smiled, thinking of the Valentino dress hanging in my closet. Actually, I have a better idea. Why don't you join me at the merger announcement gala next week? I have a feeling it's going to be quite memorable. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the window. The setting sun cast a reddish glow across my face, and for the first time in months, I recognized the woman staring back at me. She wasn't just a corporate wife anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with, and it was time the world remembered that. The Upper East Side apartment felt different in the pale light of dawn. I'd spent the night in my home office, surrounded by 2 decades of carefully preserved documents, financial records, correspondence, board meeting minutes, each piece a testament to the life I'd helped build. My Georgetown law degree hung on the wall, the gold embossing catching the morning light. I hadn't practiced law in 20 years, but I'd never stopped thinking like a lawyer. The sound of Richard's shower running upstairs provided a familiar background noise as I organized my findings into neat folders. He still had no idea I'd spent the night piecing together his carefully orchestrated plan. In the kitchen, I could hear Maria, our housekeeper of 15 years, preparing his morning coffee, black with 2 sugars, served in the Yale law mug I'd given him on our first anniversary. My phone lit up with a message from Catherine Miller. Breakfast at Le Bernardin, 9 a.m. We have much to discuss. I smiled, thinking of how Richard had always underestimated the power of the social networks I'd cultivated over the years. While he saw me hosting charity galas and ladies' luncheons, I was building alliances, gathering intelligence, and maintaining connections that would prove invaluable. Morning, darling. Richard's voice startled me from my thoughts. He stood in the doorway of my office, already dressed in one of his handmade Italian suits, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. You're up early. I looked up, studying the man I'd shared my life with. Had he always been this transparent, or had I simply learned to see through him? Just reviewing some old cases, I said, gesturing to the papers spread across my desk. It's amazing what you find in the archives. Something flickered across his face, concern, worry, before his usual confident smile returned. The past is the past, Maddie. We need to focus on the future. The merger announcement gala is next week, and there are some details we should discuss. I stood, smoothing down my silk robe. Of course, the future is exactly what I've been thinking about. I walked to the window, looking out over Central Park. The trees were turning golden, marking another change of season. You know what I've always loved about law, Richard? The way everything leaves a paper trail. He moved closer, his cologne, new, not the one I'd given him last Christmas, filling the space between us. What are you talking about? I turned to face him, maintaining the polite smile I'd perfected over years of corporate events. I've been doing some light reading. The Miller and Associates merger documents make for fascinating study, especially the subsidiary clauses regarding overseas holdings. The color drained from his face so subtly that anyone else might have missed it. But I'd spent 20 years reading this man's every micro-expression. Those documents are confidential, Maddie. Are they? I must have confused them with the public records regarding certain real estate acquisitions in London. Particularly, interesting timing, don't you think? Properties purchased 6 months ago, right around when Cassandra joined the firm. He reached for me, but I stepped away smoothly. You're jumping to conclusions. The merger is complicated. There are aspects. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I interrupted, my voice soft but firm. I understand that the woman who's been handling your overseas accounts for the past 20 years might notice when large sums of money start moving in unusual patterns. I understand that the wife who's hosted every major client dinner might have her own relationships with the partners you're planning to betray. Richard's facade cracked, just slightly. This isn't what you think. The merger is crucial for the firm's future. Sometimes sacrifices. Sacrifices? I picked up a folder from my desk. Like the sacrifice of Hayes and Partners pension fund? Or perhaps you mean the sacrificial lamb of your marriage? Tell me, when did you plan to inform me about the London position? Before or after you moved in with Cassandra? He staggered back, as if I'd struck him. How did you— No! I finished for him. Richard, darling, did you forget who helped you build your network? Who maintained your relationships? Who kept track of every favor owed, every secret kept, every deal made over drinks at the Yale Club? Moving to my desk, I pressed a button on my phone. Clara, could you please send in Mr. Wellington and Mr. Patterson? They should be waiting in the living room. Richard's eyes widened as my words registered. Marcus and James are here? What is this? The door opened, and 2 of Hayes and Partners' senior partners entered, their expressions grim. These men had been at our wedding, had vacationed with us in the Hamptons, had trusted Richard with their life's work. They're here because, unlike you, I believe in transparency with our partners, handed each man a folder. Gentlemen, you'll find detailed documentation of the real merger plans, including the intended dissolution of Hayes and Partners and the systematic dismantling of your equity shares. Marcus spoke first, his voice heavy with disappointment. Is this true, Richard? 25 years of friendship and you were going to sell us out? Richard's legendary composure finally shattered. It's not that simple. The market is changing. We need to adapt. By betraying everyone who helped build this firm? James Patterson's normally jovial face was dark with anger. By secretly planning to strip us of our partnership stakes? I sat down at my desk, watching the scene unfold. Gentlemen, you'll also find my proposal for restructuring the firm, maintaining our independence while strategically partnering with select divisions of Miller and Associates. I've already discussed this with Catherine Miller over dinner last night. She finds the idea intriguing, especially given certain irregularities in the current merger plan. Richard's head snapped toward me. You spoke to Catherine? That's impossible. She has been a member of my charitable foundation's board for the past 5 years, I finished. Yes, darling. Not all power moves happen in the boardroom. Some happen over tea at the Metropolitan Club. The room fell silent as the implications settled. Years of careful planning, of secret meetings and hidden agendas, all unraveled by the very network I had spent decades building. The corporate wife Richard had taken for granted had just outmaneuvered him at his own game. "What do you want?" Richard finally asked, his voice hollow. I stood, straightening my robe with careful precision. "Want? I want what I've always wanted, to protect this firm and the people who built it. The only difference is, now I'll be doing it from the managing partner's office." I paused, letting my words sink in. "Oh, and Richard, you might want to call Cassandra. I believe she's about to have a very interesting conversation with her mother about her role in all this." As Richard stared at me, I saw the moment he realized just how completely he'd underestimated me. The corporate wife had stepped out of the shadows, and she was wearing armor forged from 20 years of watching, learning, and preparing for exactly this moment. The merger announcement gala was 3 days away when everything accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. I was having tea at the plaza with Cassandra Miller, discussing the final details of our new arrangement, when my phone erupted with notifications. Across the table, Catherine's phone buzzed simultaneously. "It seems someone leaked the original merger documents to the press," I said calmly, stirring honey into my Earl Grey. The crystal chandeliers above cast dancing lights across our table, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in our phones. Catherine's perfectly manicured fingers tapped her screen rapidly. "The Wall Street Journal already has the story. Corporate coup, Miller and Associates hostile takeover attempt of Hayes and Partners exposed. My PR team is having an aneurysm." I set my cup down with deliberate grace. How unfortunate. I imagine the partners at Hayes and Partners will be particularly interested in the section about their planned demotions. "You didn't leak this," Catherine stated. Not a question, but an observation. Her shrewd eyes studied me over her teacup. "No need. When you make as many enemies as Richard has, someone's bound to talk." I reached for a scone, breaking it precisely in half. Though I did make sure certain documents were accessible to interested parties. The Palm Court's refined atmosphere was suddenly pierced by raised voices. At a nearby table, I recognized Jennifer Patterson, James's wife, arguing intensely with Cassandra. The younger woman's face was flushed, her usual poise shattered as Jennifer gestured angrily with her phone. "Your daughter appears to be having a difficult morning," I observed mildly. Catherine's lips tightened. Cassandra always did lack subtlety, rather like her father. She set her cup down with a sharp clink. I warned her about getting involved with married men, particularly married men with intelligent wives. The corner of my mouth lifted slightly. "Flattery, Catherine?" Observation. She leaned back, her Chanel suit impeccable despite the tension in her shoulders. "You know, when Cassandra first mentioned the merger, I thought Richard was brilliant, using my daughter to orchestrate a takeover while keeping his hands clean. Very neat, very clever." She paused, studying me. "But he forgot about you, didn't he? The power behind the throne. A common oversight." I pulled out a slim folder from my Hermes bag. "Speaking of power, I have the new proposal here. Equal partnership between our firms, maintaining both names, with a focus on international expansion. No layoffs, no demotions." Catherine took the folder but didn't open it. "And Richard? We'll be offered a choice. He can stay on as a regular partner, or he can take a generous severance package and pursue other opportunities. Perhaps in London, if he wishes." My voice remained perfectly steady, though he might find the climate there less welcoming than anticipated. Outside the plaza's windows, a light rain had begun to fall, sending well-dressed New Yorkers scurrying for cover. My phone buzzed again, Olivia calling for the third time. I silenced it without looking. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Catherine's tone held something close to admiration. "Not everything, just the things that matter." I met her gaze directly. The question is, are you ready to do what needs to be done? Before she could answer, the maitre d' approached our table, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Hayes, there's a situation in the lobby. Mr. Hayes is asking to speak with you. I glanced at Catherine, who was already gathering her things. I believe that's my cue to leave. I'll have my team review the proposal immediately. She stood, then paused. For what it's worth, Madeline, I would have chosen you as a daughter-in-law over Cassandra any day. As she departed, I took a moment to check my reflection in a silver serving tray. My makeup was flawless, my gray-streaked hair elegantly styled, every inch the corporate wife I'd been for 2 decades. But the woman in the reflection had steel in her eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. In the lobby, Richard stood. By the concierge desk, his usual composure noticeably frayed. His tie was slightly askew, a detail that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. When he saw me, his face twisted with an emotion I couldn't quite name. The journal, Maddie. Really? His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the fury underneath. Fascinating article, wasn't it? Though they missed some of the more interesting details. I kept my voice light, aware of the curious eyes watching us. The part about the London properties was particularly intriguing. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a quiet corner. Do you have any idea what you've done? The merger is falling apart. The board is calling for an emergency meeting. Cassandra's mother just left our tea date? I finished for him, gently but firmly removing his hand from my arm. Yes, we had a lovely chat about the future of both firms. She sends her regards. Richard's face went pale. You've been meeting with Catherine? For how long? Oh, darling. I smiled, the same smile I'd given him at countless charity galas and partner dinners. Did you really think you were the only one who could play this game? While you were planning your little coup with Cassandra, I was having lunch with her. Mother at the Metropolitan Club. Every Tuesday for the past 3 months. He staggered back slightly, colliding with an ornate column. This is insane. You're destroying everything I've built. Everything we built, I corrected sharply. Or did you forget the years I spent hosting your clients, smoothing over your conflicts, building the relationships that made Hayes and Partners what it is? While you were drafting merger documents, I was protecting our legacy. Our legacy? He laughed bitterly. You gave up your career to play hostess. You chose this role. No, Richard. I chose us. There's a difference. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. And now I'm choosing to save this firm from your ego. The board meeting is in an hour. I suggest you use that time to decide which matters more, your pride or your future in the firm you claim to love so much. His phone rang, Cassandra's name flashing on the screen. He stared at it, then at me, realization dawning in his eyes. You planned this. All of it. The leak, the timing, Catherine. Like you taught me, darling. In law, like in chess, you have to think 5 moves ahead. I patted his cheek gently, the way I used to when straightening his tie. Though in this case, I'd say it's checkmate. As I walked away, my heels clicking on the plaza's marble floors, I heard him call, after me, Maddie, wait. Please. We can fix this. I paused, not turning around. You know what the worst part is, Richard? You actually believe that. But some things, once broken, can't be fixed. They can only be rebuilt into something stronger. The doorman held the door for me as I stepped out into the rain. My driver was already waiting, umbrella at the ready. Behind me, through the plaza's revolving doors, I could see Richard's reflection, standing alone in the grand lobby where we'd celebrated our 10th anniversary. But I didn't look back. I had a board meeting to prepare for, and the future of Hayes and Partners, my future, was waiting. The emergency board meeting at Hayes and Partners resembled a powder keg waiting for a spark. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room, casting long shadows across faces I'd known for decades. The tension was palpable as partners filed in, their usual camaraderie replaced by wary glances and whispered conversations. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, opposite Richard's usual seat, a position I'd chosen deliberately. My laptop was open, displaying the damning Wall Street Journal article that had thrown the firm into chaos. Marcus Wellington sat to my right, his presence a silent endorsement that spoke volumes to the other partners. The door opened, and Richard strode in, Cassandra close behind. She'd clearly been crying, her mascara slightly smudged despite obvious attempts to fix it. Richard's face was a mask of forced composure, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands as he set his briefcase down. "Before we begin," he announced, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had served him so well over the years, "I want to address the misleading information that's been circulated." "Misleading?" James Patterson interrupted, slapping a copy of the merger documents onto the table. "Like the clause that would have reduced my equity share to nothing? That kind of misleading, Richard?" Sarah Chen, our head of international law, leaned forward. "Or perhaps you'd like to explain the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The ones conveniently set up right after the merger talks began?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Those arrangements were part of a broader strategy to betray every person in this room?" Marcus's normally gentle voice cut like steel. "We trusted you, Richard, some of us for over 20 years. Cassandra stepped forward, her youth and inexperience suddenly glaring in the room full of seasoned lawyers. "The merger with Miller and Associates would have given us international reach." "Us?" Elizabeth Whitman, our oldest partner, fixed Cassandra with a withering stare. "Last I checked, you were an assistant who's been here less than a year, though I suppose sleeping with the managing partner fast-tracked your career plans." The bye. Room erupted in overlapping voices, accusations flying. I remained silent, watching Richard's composure crack further with each passing moment. He kept glancing at his phone, no doubt waiting for support from Miller and Associates that wouldn't come. Finally, I closed my laptop with a quiet click that somehow cut through the chaos. "I believe," I said, my voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room, "we should discuss the alternative proposal that's already been approved by Catherine Miller." Richard's head snapped toward me. "What alternative proposal?" I withdrew copies of the new merger agreement from my briefcase, passing them around the table. "A true partnership between our firms. Equal control, shared resources, maintained autonomy. No forced retirements, no demotions, no hidden agendas." "This is ridiculous," Richard sputtered. "Catherine would never—" The conference room door opened again, and Catherine Miller herself walked in, accompanied by her chief counsel. The room fell silent. "Actually, Richard," Catherine said, taking a seat beside me, "I found Madeline's proposal quite compelling, particularly the parts about transparency and ethical governance." Cassandra stepped toward her mother. "Mom, you can't be serious. After everything we planned?" "Everything you planned?" Catherine's voice could have frozen flame. "You mean your scheme to manipulate both firms for personal gain? To destroy careers and relationships for a corner office in London?" "Mother, enough." Catherine's tone brooked no argument. "The board of Miller and Associates has already voted. We're proceeding with the new proposal, or there's no deal at all." Richard slumped in his chair, the fight visibly draining from him. "This is your doing," he said, looking at me. "You've orchestrated all of this." "No, Richard." I stood, smoothing my skirt. "You orchestrated this the moment you decided to sacrifice everyone who helped build this firm. I'm just ensuring we survive your ambition." I walked to the front of the room, taking the position Richard had held countless times before. "The vote is simple. We can move forward with a legitimate merger that benefits both firms, or we can dissolve the merger talks entirely and deal with the fallout of Richard's original plan becoming public." Elizabeth Whitman raised her hand. "And Richard's position? In the firm?" "That depends on him." I met his gaze steadily. He can remain as a partner, working within the new structure, or he can take a severance package and pursue other opportunities. You can't be serious, Cassandra interjected. Richard built this firm. You can't just… Ms. Miller, Catherine, cut in sharply. Given your involvement in this situation, I suggest you leave the room. We'll discuss your future with the firm, or lack thereof, privately. Cassandra's face crumpled. She looked at Richard, but he was staring at the table, defeated. Without another word, she fled the room. The voting took less than 15 minutes. The partners I'd known and worked with for decades chose survival over loyalty to a man who'd planned to betray them. As hands raised one by one in favor of the new proposal, I watched Richard's world crumble piece by piece. When the last vote was counted, he finally looked up at me. The anger was gone, replaced by something that might have been respect, or perhaps just resignation. You outplayed me, he said quietly. No, Richard. I just remembered something you forgot. I gathered my papers, preparing to leave. Success isn't built on power moves and secret deals. It's built on trust, loyalty, and respect for the people who stand beside you. The room slowly emptied, partners filing out to digest the day's events. Catherine touched my arm as she passed. Dinner soon? I think we have much to discuss about the future. I nodded, watching as she left. Finally, only Richard and I remained. In the conference room where we'd spent countless hours planning the firm's future together. What happens now? He asked, sounding older than I'd ever heard him. That depends on you. I moved toward the door. You have until tomorrow to decide if you want to stay and rebuild, or take the severance and start fresh. Either way, the firm will survive. And us? I paused, hand on the doorknob. There is no us anymore, Richard. You made that choice long before today. The only difference is, now everyone knows it. As I walked out of the conference room, my heels echoing on the hardwood floors, I felt 20 years of history settling into its proper place. Behind me lay a marriage built on ambition and compromise. Ahead lay a future I would shape on my own terms. The morning after the board meeting, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The city was still draped in pre-dawn shadows as I walked through the empty corridors of Hayes & Partners. My fingertips traced the brass nameplate outside. What had been Richard's office for 2 decades? By noon, the maintenance team would replace it with my name. Maria had already packed his personal items from our Park Avenue apartment. Photos, awards, the rare books he collected. They sat in labeled boxes in the guest room, waiting for him to arrange their pickup. 20 years of marriage reduced to cardboard containers and bubble wrap. The sun was rising over Manhattan when Olivia arrived, carrying 2 cups of coffee from our favorite cafe. You look different, she said, studying me as she set a cup on my new desk. Different how? Lighter, like you've set down something heavy you've been carrying for years. I smiled, taking in the view from the corner office. From here, I could see Central Park beginning to stir with early morning joggers. Maybe I have. My phone buzzed. A message from Cassandra Miller. Breakfast at Le Cirque? We should discuss the press release. After 2 decades of being the woman behind the man, I was now the woman everyone wanted to meet. The office gradually filled with the usual morning bustle, but there was an undercurrent of nervous energy. Partners and associates alike watched. Me through glass walls, their expressions a mix of respect, fear, and curiosity. The corporate wife had become the corporate warrior, and no one quite knew what to expect. Around 10, Marcus knocked on my door. Maddie, you should see this. He handed me his tablet, open to the New York Times business section. The headline read, Hayes & Partners Merger Scandal, A Tale of Betrayal and Redemption. The article was surprisingly detailed, painting a picture of a managing partner's failed coup and the unexpected rise of his wife to power. They'd even included a photo of Richard and me from last year's charity gala, both of us smiling, his hand possessively on my waist. The caption read, "Richard Hayes and wife Madeline, now interim managing partner of Hayes and Partners." Interim? I raised an eyebrow at Marcus. He shrugged. The board votes this afternoon, but we both know it's just a formality. A soft knock interrupted us. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, holding a stack of files. The Miller and Associates legal team is here for the preliminary merger discussions. They're waiting in the main conference room. I stood, smoothing my navy Armani suit. Perfect timing. Marcus, shall we? As we walked to the conference room, heads turned to watch our progress. The click of my heels on marble floors felt different now. No longer the sound of a supportive wife arriving with forgotten documents, but the approach of someone with real power. The Miller and Associates team rose as we entered. Their lead counsel, David Montgomery, extended his hand. "Mrs. Hayes." "Ms. Carter," I corrected smoothly, using my maiden name for the first time in 20 years. "Or Madeline, if you prefer." He nodded, recalibrating. "Of course, we've reviewed the new proposal. Catherine speaks very highly of your vision for the merger." We settled into negotiations, the morning stretching into afternoon as we hammered out details. I knew this dance, had watched Richard perform it countless times, but my style was different. Where he had relied on intimidation and power plays, I built consensus. Years of hosting difficult dinner parties had taught me how to read a room, how to find common ground between opposing views. Around 2, my assistant Jennifer interrupted with a message. Richard was in the lobby, asking to see me. I felt the room's energy shift as the information rippled through the conference table. "Take a break, everyone," I suggested. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes." I found Richard by the reception desk, looking somehow diminished in the space. He'd once dominated. He held a leather portfolio I recognized, the one I'd given him on our 15th anniversary. "You're doing it wrong," he said without preamble. "Excuse me?" "The merger. You're being too accommodating with Miller and Associates. They'll walk all over you." I studied him. This man I'd loved for half my life. Even now, he couldn't help trying to control the situation. "Is that really why you're here, Richard?" He deflated slightly. "I signed the severance agreement. My lawyer will deliver it this afternoon. And I'm moving to London, not with..." He paused. "I'm going alone, taking a position with Fredericks and Stone." "I know," I said quietly. "Catherine told me they'd made you an offer." His eyes narrowed. "You're still talking to Catherine?" "We're having dinner next week. She's introducing me to some interesting people at the London Stock Exchange." I let that sink in. "The world doesn't stop turning just because you exit stage left, Richard." He opened the portfolio, removing a single document. "I thought you should have this. I never filed it." It was our prenuptial agreement. I remembered signing it, young and in love, believing it would never matter. Why not? Because back then, I thought we were invincible. He placed it on the reception desk between us. "I never imagined you'd be the one to prove me right, just not in the way I expected." A group of associates walked past, their chatter dying as they noticed us. The firm's gossip mill would be working overtime today. "I should get back to my meeting," I said, gesturing toward the conference room where the Miller and Associates team waited. "Of course." He turned to leave, then paused. "The painting in your office. The one of Central Park in winter. You should keep it. You always loved it more than I did." I watched him walk toward the elevators, his shoulders straight, but missing their usual swagger. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of his reflection. A man facing the consequences of his choices, finally understanding what he'd lost. Back. In the conference room, David Montgomery was mid-sentence about market penetration strategies when his phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked up at me with new respect. Fredericks and Stone just announced Richard Hayes is joining their London office, he said. Care to comment? I smiled, thinking of the prenuptial agreement sitting unsigned at the reception desk. I believe we were discussing the Asian market expansion. Shall we continue? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of negotiations and decisions. By sunset, we had the framework of a deal that would reshape both firms while preserving their essential characters. As the Miller and Associates team packed up their briefcases, David lingered. You know, he said, when this story first broke, everyone assumed Hayes and Partners would collapse without Richard. I don't think anyone expected. A corporate wife to save the day? I finished for him. That's the thing about expectations, David. They only limit you if you let them. Later that evening, alone in my new office, I opened the bottom drawer of Richard's old desk. Inside was a bottle of Macallan 25, the same whiskey we'd shared the night we'd opened the firm. I poured a single measure into a crystal glass and walked to the window. Below, New York City sparkled in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably packing for London. Cassandra was facing her mother's disappointment, and the business world was still buzzing about the day's events. But up here, in this quiet moment, I finally felt at peace. I raised my glass to the city that had watched my transformation. The corporate wife was dead. Long live the managing partner. A week into my role as managing partner, the financial world was still reverberating from the shockwaves of what the press had dubbed the Hayes upheaval. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page feature titled, "The Revolution in Room 48B: How One Woman Transformed Manhattan's Legal Landscape." Bloomberg dedicated an entire segment to analyzing the implications for corporate governance. Even the London Financial Times weighed in with an editorial about gender dynamics in law firm leadership. I was reviewing interview requests, Forbes, Fortune, Business Insider, when Elizabeth Whitman appeared in my doorway. At 72, she remained the firm's most formidable litigator, a woman who'd broken barriers long before it was fashionable. "Have you seen this morning's Bar Association bulletin?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. I shook my head, and she passed me her tablet. The headline made me pause. Hayes and Partners scandal prompts investigation into major firms' partnership structures. "They're calling it the Madeline effect," Elizabeth said, a hint of amusement in her voice. Apparently, several other firms are facing internal reviews of their succession plans and partnership agreements. Their wives are getting particularly interested in the details. The article detailed how 3 major law firms had already announced restructuring plans with emphasis on transparency and equal partnership opportunities. 2 more were facing partner revolts over previously undisclosed merger negotiations. "You've started something," Elizabeth continued, "though I doubt that was your intention." My phone buzzed with a text from Cassandra Miller. "Lunch? The vultures are circling, and I have an interesting proposition." I smiled, thinking of how quickly alliances could shift in our world. "My intention was survival," I replied to Elizabeth. "Everything else is just collateral enlightenment." A knock at the door interrupted us. Sarah Chen entered, carrying a stack of newspapers. The Asian markets are responding to the merger announcement. The Nikkei is particularly interested in our new joint venture plans with Miller and Associates' Tokyo office. I scanned the headlines, my rudimentary Japanese sufficient to grasp the general tone. Our stock was up, client confidence was steady, and the international legal community was watching with keen interest. "There's something else," Sarah added, hesitating slightly. "Cassandra Miller has been making calls to our junior partners. Apparently, she's trying to gather support for some kind of counter-movement." Elizabeth snorted. "That girl never did know when to fold." "Let her try," I said, turning to gaze out at the Manhattan skyline. "The partners have seen the numbers. They know which way the wind is blowing." My intercom buzzed. "Miss Carter? Mrs. Wellington is here to see you." Patricia Wellington, Marcus's wife and a prominent corporate headhunter, swept into the office like a force of nature. She was wearing Chanel and carrying what appeared to be a wedding invitation. "You won't believe who's getting married," she announced without preamble. "Thomas Richardson," to his assistant. The name took me back. Thomas had been Richard's closest friend at Yale Law, another managing partner who'd recently faced a similar scandal. Let me guess, right after his divorce settlement? Patricia nodded grimly. Caroline, his wife, called me this morning. She's been going through their firm's books. Apparently, Thomas wasn't as clever as he thought with his overseas accounts. "The Madeline effect strikes again," Elizabeth murmured. My computer chimed with a new email, a press release from Fredericks and Stone announcing Richard's appointment as senior partner in their London office. The release was carefully worded, making no mention of the circumstances that had led to his relocation. "Speaking of our erstwhile leader," Patricia said, noticing the email, "the London social circuit is already buzzing. Apparently he tried to join the Cambridge Club, but someone had already made a few calls." "Catherine Miller has many friends in London," I said neutrally, though I couldn't quite suppress a smile. Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it, her eyebrows rising. "The American Bar Association wants you to keynote their annual conference. Theme: Transformative Leadership in Modern Law." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. 6 months ago, I'd been planning the seating arrangements for that same conference's gala dinner. Now, I was being asked to tell my story to the nation's legal elite. Elizabeth leaned forward. "You know what's really interesting? The number of calls I'm getting from former students, young women in big firms watching what happened here. They're starting to ask questions about their own career paths. Questions their managing partners probably don't want to answer," Patricia added. A gentle knock heralded Jennifer's arrival with the afternoon mail. Among the usual correspondence was a thick envelope from our London office. Inside was a newspaper clipping from The Guardian. "Corporate Exodus. London firms face scrutiny after Hayes scandal." "It seems our British counterparts are nervous," Sarah observed. "They should be," Elizabeth said. "You've shown that the emperor has no clothes. Every major firm has its secrets, its questionable deals, its power imbalances. Now they're all wondering who else might be taking notes, watching, waiting." My phone lit up with another message, this time from Olivia. "Emergency at the Yale Club. Richard's old crowd is imploding. Dinner later? You need to hear this." I stood, smoothing my skirt. "Ladies, if you'll excuse me, I have a lunch meeting with Catherine Miller. Sarah, can you handle the Tokyo call? Elizabeth, I'd love your thoughts on the Bar Association speech. Patricia, keep those society ears open. Information is power, and right now, we need all the power we can get." As they filed out, I caught my reflection in the window. I was wearing the same Armani suit I'd worn to countless firm events as Richard's wife, but it felt different now. The fabric hadn't changed, but the woman wearing it had. My desk phone buzzed. "Ms. Carter, the car is waiting to take you to Lady Bernardin." I gathered my things, including a folder containing documents that would reshape 3 more major law firms by the end of the month. Not through scandal or confrontation, but through the quiet power of knowledge and preparation. In the elevator, I checked my calendar for the next day. 2 board meetings, a client lunch, and a private dinner with 3 managing partners' wives who'd recently taken a keen interest in their husbands' business dealings. The revolution that had started in our conference room was spreading, not with a bang but with a whisper, passed from woman to woman over coffee dates and charity luncheons. The car was waiting at the curb, its driver holding the door with a respectful nod. As we pulled into Manhattan traffic, I opened my briefcase and removed the latest draft of my Bar Association speech. Its working title caught the afternoon light. "Power isn't taken, it's recognized." My phone buzzed one final time, a message from an unknown London number. "Maddie, can we talk?" R. I deleted it without responding. Some conversations were better left in the past, especially when the future was proving so interesting. The Good Morning America studio lights felt uncomfortably warm as I sat across from their star anchor, Angela Morrison. The producer had warned me they were running a special series on women breaking the glass ceiling in traditional male bastions. My story, it seemed, had struck a particular nerve. "So, Madeline," Angela leaned forward, her expression carefully calibrated to show both empathy and admiration. "You've become something of a symbol for women in corporate America. Did you ever imagine your personal story would resonate with so many people?" The camera's red light blinked steadily, reminding me that millions were watching. I'd chosen my words carefully, just as I'd chosen my outfit, a soft gray Dior suit that projected strength without aggression. "What resonates, I think, isn't my particular story," I replied. "It's the recognition that power doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, building over years of observation and preparation." Angela nodded encouragingly. "Your speech at the Bar Association conference last week has gone viral. The phrase corporate wife uprising is trending on social media. How do you respond to critics who say you've inspired a wave of distrust in corporate marriages?" Through the glare of studio lights, I could see the production team leaning forward, hungry for something sensational. Instead, I smiled, thinking of the 3 dinner meetings I'd had this week with women whose husbands ran Fortune 500 companies. "I haven't inspired distrust," I said. "I've encouraged awareness. There's a difference between supporting your partner and surrendering your power. Many women are simply realizing they've been playing chess all along. They just didn't know it." The interview continued, touching on the merger, the industry changes, the ripple effects through corporate America. But it wasn't until the cameras stopped rolling that Angela asked the question she really wanted to answer. "Off the record," she said, walking me to the green room, "my husband's a senior partner at Goldman Sachs. Last week, he suddenly suggested updating our prenup. Should I be worried?" I caught our reflection in a wall mirror. 2 power women in designer suits having a conversation that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. "That depends, Angela. How good are you at chess?" Outside the studio, New York was embracing autumn with typical enthusiasm. Yellow cabs honked their way through traffic as my driver navigated toward my next appointment. My phone buzzed with messages, most notably one from Cassandra Miller. "Just had lunch with Richard's new managing partner in London. Fascinating conversation about their partnership structure. Call me." The car pulled up to Columbia Law School, where I was scheduled to give a guest lecture. The topic, modern. Corporate governance and gender dynamics. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same institution where I'd once sat beside Richard, both of us dreaming of legal glory. The lecture hall was packed, not just with students, but with professors and practicing attorneys. I recognized several faces from Manhattan's legal circles, including a few women who'd recently initiated reviews of their husbands' firm's partnership agreements. As I took the podium, my phone buzzed again. A text from Olivia. "Financial Times wants to interview you for their Women in Business special issue. Also, Cassandra Miller just got engaged to a junior partner at Fredericks & Stone. London office. The plot thickens." I set my phone aside, focusing on the eager faces before me. These young women weren't just here to learn about corporate law. They were here to understand how power really worked in their chosen profession. Traditional legal education, I began, focuses on statutes, precedents, and procedures. But there's another kind of law at work in corporate America, the unwritten rules that govern power dynamics. Understanding these rules isn't just about survival. It's about transformation. A hand shot up in the third row. "Ms. Carter, what advice would you give to women starting their legal careers today?" I thought of my younger self, sitting in these same halls, believing that success meant supporting someone else's dreams. Watch, learn, build networks, and never mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes the most powerful move in the game is the one your opponent doesn't see coming. After the lecture, a group of female faculty members invited me to join them for coffee. As we settled into the faculty lounge, Dean Patricia Morrison, no relation to the morning show host, broached the subject everyone had been dancing around. "We're revising our corporate law curriculum," she said, "adding a new component on gender dynamics in firm leadership. Would you be interested in developing it with us?" Before I could respond, my phone lit up with a news alert. Breaking: major law firms announce industry-wide review of partnership policies. The accompanying photo showed Richard leaving Fredericks & Stone's London office, looking harried. "Your influence is spreading," one of the professors observed. I took a sip of coffee, savoring the moment. It's not my influence. It's recognition of a power that was always there, just waiting to be acknowledged. The conversation shifted to the practical aspects of curriculum development. But my mind was already racing ahead to my next meeting, a private dinner with 3 prominent corporate wives who'd recently taken a keen interest in their husbands' business dealings. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from Cassandra Miller. "Just heard from the London Stock Exchange. They're launching an investigation into partnership structures at major firms. Apparently, several wives of board members have raised concerns. Coincidence?" I smiled, thinking of the quiet conversations I'd had at charity galas and social events over the years. The networks I'd built while playing the perfect corporate wife were proving more valuable than any legal strategy. As I left Columbia, a young law student stopped me. "Ms. Carter, I just wanted to say, you've changed how I see my future in corporate law." I studied her eager face, seeing echoes of my younger self. "The future of corporate law was always going to change," I replied. The only question was who would lead that change. In the car heading back to the office, I reviewed my schedule for the week. 2 more media appearances, a keynote speech at a women's leadership conference, and a series of very private meetings with women who'd recently discovered just how much power they'd had all along. My phone lit up with one final message of the day, from Elizabeth Whitman. "Just got word. 3 more managing partners' wives have hired corporate lawyers. The revolution isn't just spreading, Maddie, it's evolving." I looked out at the Manhattan skyline, thinking of how much had changed in such a short time. The corporate wife hadn't just discovered her power. She'd sparked a movement that was reshaping the very foundation of corporate America. And this was just the beginning. The winter wind whipped across Manhattan as I stepped out of my town car, facing the imposing facade of the Yale Club. Inside, the annual Bar Association Gala was in full swing, but my attention was focused on the message I'd received an hour earlier. "We need to talk. I'm back in New York. Richard." 3 months had passed since he'd left for London. 3 months of transformation, not just for me, but for the entire legal landscape. Tonight's gala wasn't just another social event. It was the first time many of the city's legal power players would be gathering since the wave of changes began, sweeping through their firms. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and old money pretense. As I handed my coat to the attendant, I caught snippets of conversation around me. "Did you hear about Henderson and Blake? 3 more managing partners stepped down this week. My wife's been asking about our partnership agreement." "Madeline." Cassandra Miller's voice cut through the murmur. She stood by the bar, elegant in midnight blue Valentino. "He's by the fireplace." I didn't need to ask who she meant. I could feel Richard's presence across the room, like a disturbance in the carefully maintained social atmosphere. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an urgent message from Sarah Chen. "Emergency. London office calling. Something's happening at Fredericks & Stone." Catherine touched my arm. "You should know. Cassandra's here too, and she's not alone." I followed her gaze to see Cassandra Miller standing with a group of junior partners from various firms. She was wearing a designer dress that screamed, "Trying too hard," but it was her expression that caught my attention, a mixture of desperation and determination. "She's been gathering support," Catherine continued, her voice low. "Apparently, there's a movement among the younger partners. They're calling it a resistance against the old guard upheaval." I smiled, taking a champagne flute from a passing waiter. "Let me guess. They're particularly concerned about the new transparency requirements. Among other things, the London Stock Exchange investigation has them nervous, especially those with creative accounting practices." The room suddenly hushed as Marcus Wellington took the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this year's Bar Association Gala. We gather at a time of unprecedented change in our profession." My phone buzzed again, Olivia this time. "Reuters breaking news. Fredericks and Stone partners calling emergency meeting. Richard's name mentioned." I scanned the room, noting the subtle power dynamics at play. The old guard clustered together, their wives watching with new awareness. Younger partners huddled in corners, whispering urgently. And there, by the fireplace, Richard stood alone, looking both out of place and eerily at home. "He's got something planned," Catherine murmured. Mother's intuition. Before I could reply, Cassandra broke away from her group and approached the podium. Marcus paused in his speech, surprise flickering across his face as she whispered something to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice carefully neutral, "Ms. Miller has requested a moment to address the gathering." The room's energy shifted palpably. I felt Catherine stiffen beside me as her daughter took the stage. "Distinguished colleagues," Cassandra began, her voice carrying a forced confidence. "We're here tonight celebrating tradition, but also facing unprecedented attacks on our profession's foundation. The recent wave of so-called reforms threatens everything we've built." My phone lit up with another message, this time from Elizabeth Whitman. "London Partners meeting ended. Vote of no confidence in senior leadership. Richard's position in jeopardy." Cassandra continued, her voice growing stronger. "A small group of individuals has sparked a movement that threatens the very structure of corporate law. They call it progress. I call it destruction." I felt eyes turning toward me but kept my expression neutral. Across the room, Richard had moved closer to the stage, his face unreadable. "Therefore," Cassandra announced, "I'm proud to announce the formation of the New Guard Coalition. We're committed to protecting traditional partnership structures and preventing the dissolution of established hierarchies." A smattering of applause came from her corner of supporters. But before it could gain momentum, Catherine stepped forward. "Fascinating announcement, darling," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "Will this coalition be addressing the offshore accounts you helped establish at Fredericks and Stone? Or perhaps the questionable property transfers in Mayfair?" The room fell silent. Cassandra's face paled. "Mother, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Catherine's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Just as I understand why the London Stock Exchange is particularly interested in certain recent transactions." My phone buzzed one final time, a message from Sarah. "Fredericks and Stone partners voting now. Richard's future in the balance." As if on cue, Richard stepped, forward. "If I might add something to this discussion." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. I could see it in his stance, the way he commanded attention. The old Richard, the one who'd built and nearly destroyed Hayes and Partners, was making his last stand. But before he could speak, the grand doors of the ballroom burst open. David Montgomery from Miller and Associates strode in, followed by two members of the London Stock Exchange's Oversight Committee. "I apologize for interrupting," David announced, his voice carrying authority that silenced the room. "But we have some rather pressing matters to discuss, particularly concerning recent activities at Fredericks and Stone's London office." Richard's composure cracked, just slightly. Cassandra took an involuntary step back from the podium. And in that moment, I saw the last pieces of their carefully constructed world begin to crumble. I moved toward the center of the room, my heels clicking on the marble floor. "Perhaps," I suggested, my voice calm but carrying, "we should all take a moment to consider what we're really fighting for here. Is it tradition, or is it the right to operate without accountability?" The room held its breath, waiting for the next move in this high-stakes game. But I already knew how it would end. Because while Richard and Cassandra had been plotting their counterattack, I'd been building something far more powerful, a network of women who'd finally recognized their own strength. "The vote is in," Sarah whispered, appearing at my side. "Fredericks and Stone Partners have spoken. Richard's out, and the London Stock Exchange is launching a full investigation." I caught Richard's eye across the room. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd married, brilliant, ambitious, but ultimately undone by his own hubris. Then he turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Cassandra standing alone at the podium, her new coalition crumbling before it began. "Catherine," touched my arm. "Ready for the next phase?" I smiled, thinking of the documents waiting in my office, evidence that would reshape not just the legal profession, but the entire landscape of corporate power. "Always ready," I replied. "The game isn't over, it's just beginning." Snow fell softly outside the windows of Hayes & Partners as I reviewed the morning's headlines. The Financial Times led with, "Corporate Law Faces Historic Restructuring. London Stock Exchange. Investigation Expands." The Wall Street Journal followed with, "Fredericks and Stone Collapse. The End of an Era in International Law." But it was the New York Times piece that captured my attention. "The Silent Revolution. How Corporate Wives Reshaped Power in Manhattan's Legal Elite." My intercom buzzed. "Ms. Carter, the London team is on line 1, and Mr. Hayes' lawyer has been calling all morning." Through the glass walls of my office, I could see the firm humming with renewed energy. The merger with Miller & Associates had transformed not just our business, but the entire industry's approach to partnership and power. The old boys network was crumbling, replaced by something more equitable, more transparent. "Madeline." Catherine Miller's voice filled my office as she strode in, a copy of the London Times in hand. "Have you seen the latest? Cassandra's engagement is off. Apparently, her fiancé at Fredericks & Stone had second thoughts after the investigation revealed her role in certain offshore transactions." I gestured for her to sit. "How is she taking it?" "Better than expected. She's agreed to cooperate with the stock exchange investigation. Turns out my daughter has quite a detailed memory when it comes to certain financial arrangements." My phone lit up with a message from Olivia. "Richard's lawyer wants to discuss settlement terms." Apparently, London wasn't as welcoming as he'd hoped. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the city in pristine white. Somewhere out there, Richard was facing the consequences of his choices. The mighty managing partner, reduced to negotiating his own survival. "Ms. Carter?" Jennifer appeared in the doorway. "The partnership committee is ready for you in the main conference room." Today's meeting would finalize the new structure of Hayes & Partners, or rather, Hayes Miller & Associates International, as we'd soon be known. The glass ceiling hadn't just been broken, it had been systematically dismantled. "Quite a morning," Elizabeth Whitman commented as I entered the conference room. The senior partners were already assembled, along with representatives from Miller & Associates' global offices. The energy was different now, less hierarchical, more collaborative. Sarah Chen began the presentation, outlining the firm's transformation over the past 6 months. Revenue was up, client confidence had soared, and our new transparency policies had become the industry standard. The old guard's predictions of chaos had proven spectacularly wrong. My phone buzzed again. A message from Marcus. "Richard's at the Yale Club. Says he wants to return some old files. Should I send security?" I thought for a moment, then replied, "No, I'll handle it." The meeting concluded with a unanimous vote on the new partnership structure. As the room cleared, Catherine lingered. "You know this isn't over, right? The old guard won't go quietly." "They don't have to go quietly," I replied. "They just have to go." The Yale Club was quiet in the late afternoon snow. Richard sat at our old table in the members' lounge, a leather briefcase at his feet. He looked older, the London fog having done him no favors. "Maddie," he said as I approached, "you look well." "Success agrees with me." I sat across from him, noting how he avoided my gaze. "I heard about Fredericks and Stone." He flinched slightly. "You won. Isn't that enough?" This was never about winning, Richard. It was about justice, about recognition, about transforming a system that treated women as accessories rather than architects of success. He pushed the briefcase toward me. "These belong to your father. His original case files from when he started practicing. I found them when I was clearing out my London office." I touched the worn leather, remembering my father's words about power and responsibility. He'd been ahead of his time, encouraging me to pursue law when most of his contemporaries still saw it as a man's profession. "The London Stock Exchange investigation," Richard said quietly. "That was you, wasn't it? The anonymous tip about the offshore accounts?" "Actually, that was Cassandra, though she didn't realize it at the time. Amazing what people reveal when they think they're in control." His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water. "I underestimated you, all these years." "You underestimated all of us, Richard. Every wife, every assistant, every woman you saw as merely decorative. We were watching, learning, building networks while you thought you were building empires." Through the club's windows, Manhattan glowed in the winter twilight. Somewhere in those illuminated towers, other women were having similar conversations, reclaiming their power one boardroom at a time. "What happens now?" Richard asked, sounding genuinely lost. "Now? You face the consequences of your choices. The London investigation, the partnership dissolution, the client exodus. It's all part of a larger transformation. The legal world is changing, Richard. The question is whether you're willing to change with it." My phone buzzed. Catherine. Again. "Tokyo office confirms. 3 more international firms adopting our transparency protocols. The revolution's gone global." Richard noticed my slight smile. "More victories?" "More progress," I corrected. "The kind that can't be undone with backroom deals and old boy networks." As I stood to leave, he caught my arm. "I did love you, Maddie, in my way. I know, but your way wasn't enough. Not for me, not for the countless other women who deserved better." Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the city pristine and expectant. My driver held the door as I slid into the warmth of the car. "Back to the office?" he asked. I checked. My phone. Messages from women across the city, across the country, each one part of the quiet revolution that had begun in a Manhattan law firm and was now reshaping corporate America. "Yes," I replied. "There's still work to be done." The car pulled away from the Yale Club, leaving Richard and the past behind. Ahead lay a future I'd helped create, not just for myself, but for every woman who'd ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed as just a corporate wife. 1 year to the day after Richard left for London, I stood at the podium of the Harvard Law School graduation ceremony as the keynote speaker. The sea of eager faces before me reminded me of my own graduation, decades ago, when I'd believed success meant standing behind a powerful man rather than becoming powerful in my own right. Spring sunshine bathed the courtyard in golden light as I shared my story, not just of personal triumph, but of systemic transformation. In the front row, Elizabeth Whitman sat beside Cassandra Miller, both women now serving on the advisory board for the newly established Women in Corporate Leadership Initiative. "The world you're entering," I told the graduates, "is fundamentally different from the one I faced 30 years ago. Not because time passed, but because women finally recognized the power they'd held all along. The power to observe, to connect, to transform." My phone rested silently in my pocket. Its usual stream of messages paused for this moment. Earlier that morning, I'd received news that would once again reshape the landscape of corporate law. The London Stock Exchange had announced new governance requirements, directly inspired by the changes we'd implemented at Hayes, Miller and Associates International. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me, her newly received diploma clutched in her hands. "Ms. Carter, your story. It's why I chose corporate law. But there's something I've been wondering. What happened to Richard?" I smiled, thinking of the email I'd received just last week. Richard had finally resurfaced in Singapore, teaching business ethics at a small university. The irony hadn't escaped anyone. "He found his own path," I replied, "as we all must." Later that evening, I hosted a dinner at my Park Avenue apartment. Not the one I'd shared with Richard, but a new space I'd created for myself. Around my table sat the women who'd been instrumental in reshaping corporate America. Cassandra Miller, now spearheading international governance reforms. Elizabeth Whitman, mentoring a new generation of female lawyers. Sarah Chen, recently named managing partner of our Asian operations. "Have you seen the latest numbers?" Olivia asked, passing a bottle of wine. 40% of major law firms have restructured their partnership agreements in the past year. They're calling it the Carter effect now, not just the Madeline effect. "Numbers are one thing," Catherine commented, "but culture, that's the real change. My granddaughter asked me yesterday if there was ever a time when women couldn't be managing partners. She couldn't even imagine it." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sparkled in the twilight. Somewhere out there, other dinners were taking place. Other women were gathering, sharing stories, building networks. The revolution hadn't ended. It had evolved. My phone lit up with a message from Marcus Wellington. "Thought you'd want to know. Cassandra Miller just made partner at a boutique firm in Chicago. She's heading their corporate governance division. People can change." "Speaking of change," Elizabeth said, noting my smile, "have you heard about the new legislative proposals? Senator Harrison's wife apparently took a keen interest in corporate transparency after our story broke." The conversation flowed into the night, touching on victories and challenges, personal triumphs, and professional transformations. These women had become more than allies. They were architects of change, each in their own way. Around midnight, as my guests were leaving, Catherine lingered. "You know what Richard never understood?" she mused, gazing out at the city. "Power isn't about control. It's about influence, about creating ripples that become waves." I thought of the waves we'd created, the restructured firms, the empowered women, the transformed industry. But more than that, I thought of the subtle shifts, the way junior associates now spoke up in meetings, the increasing number of women in corner offices, the changing dynamics in corporate marriages. The next morning, I arrived early at the office. Hayes, Miller and Associates International occupied the same physical space as the old Hayes and Partners, but the energy was entirely different. The walls were glass now, literally and metaphorically, and the corridors buzzed with diverse voices. Jennifer met me at the elevator with my schedule, board meetings, client calls, and an afternoon session with a group of female law students, starting our new mentorship program. But first, there was one particular task I'd been looking forward to. In my office, I opened a leather-bound album, my father's collection of legal documents and news clippings. To his carefully preserved history, I added a new article. Corporate Law's Glass Ceiling Shattered, The Legacy of the Carter Revolution. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Maddie, Congratulations on Harvard. You were right. About everything. R. I didn't respond. Some conversations belonged in the past, while others were just beginning. On my desk lay invitations to speak at law schools across the country, requests for interviews, and proposals for books about corporate transformation. But more importantly, there were files detailing our next initiatives: scholarships for women in corporate law, mentorship programs, governance reform proposals. The revolution hadn't just changed the present, it had secured the future. A knock at my door announced Sarah's arrival. Ready for the board meeting? We're voting on the new partnership track proposals today. I gathered my materials, pausing to look at the view from my office, the same view Richard had once commanded. But where he had seen a kingdom to control, I saw a landscape of possibility. More than ready, I replied. The future's waiting. As we walked to the conference room, I passed dozens of faces: young associates, seasoned partners, clients, and staff. Each one had their own story, their own path to power. The corporate wife hadn't just found her voice, she'd created a chorus. And somewhere out there, in corner offices and boardrooms across the globe, other women were discovering their own power, writing their own stories, creating their own revolutions. The game hadn't ended, it had only grown larger, more inclusive, more transformative. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the conference room table. As I took my seat at its head, I thought of that day in the restaurant, watching Richard and Cassandra through the glass. I'd felt powerless then, but I'd been wrong. Power had always been there, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be claimed. And now, at last, it had found its true voice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.